everybody was asking when is it going to happen? And I think he probably thought, well, actually, um, sooner or later, I've got to, the one thing you do as prime minister is this very lonely decision of calling election, but you seize the agenda. And I think you do it at the moment when, you're ready and everyone else, the opponents are not ready. And therefore you go for it.
We are off. The button has been pressed. The firing gun has been started. And the rest, well, you know how it goes from here. Well, actually, none of us know how it goes from here because that's one of the things we're looking forward to. Kate Ferguson rubbing her hands with a unique kind of enthusiasm. I want to welcome now to the studio Lord Bethell, former Conservative Health Minister. Welcome to you.
Good evening, John.
So we've had a lot of discussion, Lord Bethell, about the Prime Minister's speech, and people saying it lacked vision, it lacks a kind of clarity you need in an election campaign. Did you see what those critics did not see? Did you see a clarity and a vision there? What was it?
Well, Kate put it well. There wasn't a huge amount of drama. There wasn't a big sort of Clarkson's Farm type show on earth. There wasn't a sort of Wolfie Smith type appeal to your beta instincts. So it was missing a lot of the things that we have come accustomed to in politics. But these two people, they're really pitching to be your bank manager at a time of financial pressure and geopolitical uncertainty. They're going for that solid central appeal. Now, I think Kate is right. There's not a lot of positivity in that. But what there was a sense of confidence and surety. And that's clearly what they're both pitching for. And we all pick up our emotional cues from sometimes quite small micro gestures, not always from the big drama.
Right, Kate is nodding.
Yeah, I really think that's an important point. And I think, John, it's what we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? About you were saying the rain is a problem and the music is a problem. And some people might dismiss it and say that stuff doesn't matter. But I actually think it really does matter. And I also think when I was listening to Rishi Sunak's, the start of his speech, I had this sudden moment where my tummy sort of flipped and I thought, oh my goodness, have we called this wrong? Is he actually resigning? Because the tone of the speech...
You really thought that was possible?
Yeah, because the tone of the speech was, I did everything for you in the pandemic. I made sure that you were safe in the pandemic. I've always promised you that. And I thought, God, this sounds like the type of thing that you say when you are telling people that you're proud of what you've achieved and you're going to move on. He obviously then did shift it, but the message only shifted to, look, I know you're all not feeling it yet, but I promise you I'm going to get you there. For me, after 14 years in office, that isn't the most convincing argument for an election campaign.
Yeah.
A problem for politicians, and by the way, this is in several countries, not just in Britain, is that if you try to pitch a big positive story, which is what we have grown to expect and what you would normally regard as normal political currency, the voters don't believe you because they don't trust politicians at all on anything. And if you try to tell a story of sunny uplands and delivery and the things that you're going to guarantee the voters, you can find that is really counterproductive because you actually come across as untrustworthy. I know what Kate means, that it did have a tone to it, and of course the rain didn't help at all. But what I think he's trying to go for is trust and being reliable and being someone that you can relate to. And he's going to try and roll out the positive messages in the election campaign ahead.
I wonder how the Prime Minister, how Rishi Sunak, does that from where we are now, because we are where we are. And I look at the opinion polls as you do, as we all do, and the Prime Minister's own personal ratings are pretty dismal. They are pretty poor. People have turned. He was pretty popular, comparatively speaking, when he took over from Liz Truss after the debacle of those 49 days of Liz Truss's premiership. He was more popular than the party. That's not the case anymore. Is that reversible?
I think conceptually it's reversible. And I was a journalist in 1992 when John Major pulled it out of the hat. It was the most extraordinary turnaround. No one really thought that was going to happen. I think one of the things he's got going for him is the economy. And one of the reasons, surely, in that discussion when they decided to go ahead was good economic news does create a feel-good factor in the nation. Now, there's lots of people hurting. The cost of living crisis is still with us. Plenty of people still struggling. But you do get the feeling that the economy has turned a corner. And on that, he does have a point, I think.
Well, I could say except that we know that inflation has come down. We're close to the Bank of England's target now, but Citi thought it was going to be more than that. And now the expectations of cuts in interest rates.
Yes.
And we're only talking about, one or two cuts of 25 basis points, a quarter point each side. The timing of that seems to be slipping rather than advancing. So even if we had more by way of cuts before election day, and how can that happen? it takes time for that stuff to sink in, and people are still hurting.
That's true. And speculation on interest rates has proved to be incredibly unreliable in the last
day
couple
to
of
day,
years.
yeah.
I know. But you are right. There's not going to be a big game-changing cut in interest rates between now
So
and
where does the
election
feel
day.
good come from?
But the feel-good, it comes from people's sense of where the country is heading. And as we go into summer, there is a feeling that the increase in prices has slowed down. I know that's not the same as them coming down, and that job security is going up, and that the prospects for things getting better have improved. That you'll remember that in 1997, and I'm going to argue against myself a bit here. You definitely felt the green shoots, and we ran a sort of green shoots poll at the time. That actually worked out very well for Labour and for Tony Blair, because people decided that although things were getting better, they weren't going to vote for John Major. But it wasn't just that the figures were improving, it was the sense in the country that the economy had turned a corner.
To be fair, you're entitled to argue against yourself in this forum. I do that on a daily basis, when I'm perfectly honest. Kate Ferguson.
Yeah, I was going to say two things. Number one, I think that we're so used, aren't we, to this idea that politicians, their big pitch for a general election should be a hopeful pitch. We've had this lots with Rishi and also with Keir, like, come on, where's your message of hope? But actually, I was talking this about with some people last year, and they said, Kate, you keep banging on about hope. The next election's going to be fought on fear. Fear for the economy, fear for our national security, and who can win the argument over security and protection, meaning security at work, security at home for your family, but also security on an international stage. So I think we're just looking at a bit of a different election to, say, 2019, which was much more kind of bullish and bluster and we can get stuff done. Oh, sorry, John.
No, I was going to say, if it's about that, Kate, if it's about stick with what you know, don't stick your neck out, don't take a chance with a lot who aren't tested, who may not have the experience that you want, then we're talking about a shift from positive to negative campaigning, aren't we? It's not just enough to say, trust me. You need to say, don't trust them, which is the way campaigning happens a lot of the time. Would that be a wise or good thing to do, do you think, Lord Bethel?
It's not just, I don't think that, I'm not against negative campaigning, and all campaigns need really good negative campaigning to work well, because you have to differentiate your product from the other guy too. But if you go and sit in focus groups with the public today and talk to them about what's on their mind, it is, as Kate said, anxiety about the future for their payday at the end of the month, for their children's prospects, for their parents and how they're being looked after. Those are the questions that are on people's mind. If you roll in and start talking about get-rich schemes and how it's all going to be fine and we're going to be a booming economy, and it's that lands so badly, but given the mood of where people are today.
Yes.
So both Keir and Rishi have picked up on this a bit, and in their own way are trying to emote reassurance and confidence. Now, it makes pretty tedious telly, and it doesn't give you the entertaining story that, certainly Corbyn and Johnson did in 2019. That was more knockabout fun. But it is appealing to where people are, I think, in their sentiment.
But isn't part of the problem that, the reality is if the Tories thought that there was a way that you were going to get a couple of decent economic announcements before an autumn or a sort of November election, and maybe a budget or a fiscal event where you could offer another tax cut, they would have held out. They would have gone longer. That was always the intention. But the reality is now those numbers don't look good for an autumn statement to give people more tax cuts. They haven't seen a bounce off the back of them. It's less about a positive economic message now. It's more about the fact that actually things could potentially get even worse.
Yes, it is unreliable. But I remember when I was thinking about asking my wife to marry me, and I thought to myself, am I ever going to get better looking? Is she ever going to be more in love with me than this moment? And when I reached the stage, I thought, probably not. I popped the question. And he does make a convincing argument.
Yeah.
Did you really think about it? Is that really the thought?
Yeah, of course, that's the calculation.
On that thought, which, by the way, is probably truer than many people imagine.
Get your proposals in now.
Exactly. Maybe women don't, in many cases, understand quite the lack of confidence that goes through the minds of people like you and me when it comes to trying to persuade them to like us more. Anyway, such a pleasure. Let's hopefully do it again, Lord Bethel. We got Kate Ferguson here, we got Kate McCann right there, and we got you there. So tell me what you're thinking. Send me a text, send me a tweet. Want to know what you are thinking at 7:19 on John Pienaar and Friends. The Election Station Times Radio. I'm John Pienaar. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with a lot to talk about on this day. The day the Prime Minister surprised an awful lot of people by calling a snap election for July the 4th. The 4th of July. Now, let's get the thoughts of Ben Bradshaw, the Labour MP for Exeter. Hello to you, Ben.
Hello, John.
Hi, you're going to tell us you're massively up for it, aren't you now?
Well, I'm standing down, so I'm definitely up for
you're
it.
not. You're down for it. Well, then you can be. Well, then you can be incredibly frank, because you are not going to be on the doorstep as an ex-MP. I'm sure you're going to be knocking on doors, though, Ben, aren't you?
I will be on doors, of course. I shall be in Exeter campaigning for my fantastic successor, Steve Race.
Right. So you need to be up for it, don't you? I mean, don't let yourself off the hook that easily. And when you're on those doorsteps around Exeter, I mean, how do you deal with the fact that so many members of the public, I know your party leads in the polls, they don't quite get Keir Starmer, except for the fact that he's not Rishi Sunak and he's not a Conservative.
Well, I accept the mood is very different from the mood that I remember in 1997 when I was first elected. But actually, I have the feeling that the more people see of Keir, the more they like him, whereas the more people see of Sunak, the less they like him, which might be the explanation for why he's taken us all by surprise and called an election rather earlier than we were expecting him to.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been discussing the reasons why that may have happened, why we believe it did. It did happen, but you're selling change. You can sell change, because if Labour gets in, there will be a change. But you can't sell a huge amount by way of sunlit uplands, can you? Because you're going to be very unlike Labour in 1997, actually, 1992. But you've got a pretty grim economic picture, which you will be inheriting. How can you make shining promises on the basis of what you would be inheriting?
Well, we're not making shining promises, which goes back to the point you made in your last question. And for that very reason, but not only the public mood is very different, but the economic reality is very different. The Tories have made such a mess of running the economy for the last 14 years that it would be completely ridiculous and incredible for an opposition leader to promise anything that very modest promises that he's made. But there is one very strong similarity with 97, in that if you remember the pledges that we made back then, they were actually very modest. We did a lot more in government. We under-promised and over-delivered.
Yeah.
And if I have one political criticism of the successive Conservative Prime Ministers we've seen, they've done exactly the opposite. They've promised the earth and they've delivered nothing. So I think he is absolutely right to have this minimalist, modest agenda. It's exactly where the public are. They wouldn't buy grandiose promises or visionary rhetoric. They want someone who's competent, who's decent, who's got integrity, who can actually do a decent job of running the country.
Would it work out like that, though? I mean, yes, I mean, change, I get that, and maybe just investing a bit of hope in that change. But people are so fed up, aren't they, with the state of our public services? You name the service, they're fed up with it, and they will expect results. They will expect improvements, and you can't be sure you're not going to show anything very demonstrably better than what we got anytime soon.
Well, I think that is a challenge, and I think you're right. The public will expect improvements, but I think the public, I think sometimes political commentators and politicians don't give the public enough credit. The public know the mess the country is in. The public know how hard it's going to be. The public know the state of the public finances. They know it's going to be difficult. But I think if they see some signals early on in that Labour government, if there is a Labour government, that things are getting better and decisions are being taken in a more competent, ordered way, that there's some kind of strategy that's being delivered rather than the chaos we've had in the last few years, I think they will put their trust in that government to deliver. But I think Labour will need at least 2 terms to undo the damage that's been done by the Tories in the last 14 years.
And I guess a lot of patience from some of your traditional allies and supporters. I'm thinking now of trade unions and trade union members and public service workers who've seen their pay pretty much squeezed for a very long time. They're not going to get much change out of you either, despite the change and despite any hopes they may have of a better relationship with the government and more to show for it.
Well, I would hope that all workers and everyone in the country will benefit from a more competent economic management of the country than we've had in recent years, and I'm confident that will happen. But actually, we have a very good package and a very radical but sensible and deliverable package for workers' rights. And I think that the fact that you saw a very positive meeting between Keir and one or two of his shadow cabinet and the trade unions last week. It was all peace and love, and I think everyone understands and realises the priority now is winning the election and pulling together. And yes, of course, there will be enormous challenges after that election in terms of managing expectations, and just the day-to-day business of government is really, really hard.
Yes.
But I'm sure my colleagues are well aware of that. I think Keir has been brilliantly strategic. He's been repeatedly underestimated since he became Labour leader. And I'm sure he and his team are very well prepared for what might be coming if they win.
Yeah.
But of course, he won't be taking anything for granted, and he'll be out campaigning very hard over the next 5 to 6 weeks.
And Ben, to sell and to deliver a long-term project, a 10-year project for the country, it helps to have a really big majority at Westminster, doesn't it? How confident do you feel of getting one of those?
I wouldn't want to predict the outcome at the moment, John. Not a single vote's been cast. I do feel more optimistic than I have at any time since.
Well, you don't believe the polls, Ben. The polls, you know what the polls say. They suggest you're heading for a whopping majority. You don't believe them.
I don't believe that the current polls will be reflected in the eventual result.
Why not? Why not, Ben?
Well, because governments always narrow the gap during election campaigns. Would be my guess at the moment. However, judging by the first couple of hours, if Sunak's campaign is going to go as disastrously as his launch in Downing Street did, we might even extend our lead in the polls. I wouldn't rule any result out, John, at the moment. I think politics is so volatile. It's so changed from the old tribal politics that we used to have in this country that I think it would be a fool of a politician at this stage in an election campaign to predict the outcome. As I say, I'm more confident than I've been since 2005 that Labour has a chance of winning. I wouldn't put it any more strongly than that, but I think you're right. A bigger majority would be better for the country.
Kate Ferguson.
Oh, you're giving us a fair bit of expectation management there, Ben, aren't you?
Well, I think expectation management is very sensible, not only in opposition but also in government. There's been a bit more of that from the Tory prime ministers in recent years. They might not have been so much trouble as they are.
You're standing down, so not so much skin in the game. But if you had to pick one thing that you really want a Labour government to achieve in their first term in power, one transformative change, what would be your number one?
Oh, there are so many. I guess as a former health minister who presided over the shortest waiting times, highest public satisfaction and highest staff satisfaction in the NHS's history, I think progress on getting NHS waiting lists down and rescuing the NHS from the parlous state that it's currently in.
Kate McCann.
Do you have a fear for this election campaign, Ben? Because we've been talking about how it may well be negative, it could well be quite dirty. Do you have any fears about that kind of thing?
I do, and we had a very interesting briefing at the weekly Parliamentary Labour Party on Monday night from our campaign coordinator, and he revealed a deep fake social media post that accused a Labour candidate in one of the elections, I can't remember which, we had at the beginning of May, that suggested that he had been guilty of making a racial slur. It was a fake, but it took 3 days for the Labour Party to ascertain that it was a fake. And I really worry that there will be people out there, I'm not necessarily saying the Tories will do this, but there are, as we know, rogue stakes and other bad actors who will put this stuff about. And if I could deliver any message to you and your listeners, is just be very careful about what you believe on social media during this election campaign.
That's so interesting. Was that briefing to warn you as MPs then that this kind of stuff is likely to happen in the election campaign and how to spot it? Or
the only advice really given to us was not to amplify stuff like this, because as you know, people who are interested in politics, who are engaged in politics, who follow politics on social media, if they see something, there's a temptation to amplify it. And yes, there was a very clear message to us all, really, not to amplify and react on social media to it, but to report it to the party so that the party can take the necessary steps to authenticate it or otherwise. And I'm sure all the other political parties are doing this. I think the failure of the government to do anything about fake news and this kind of thing on social media is a real worry in this campaign. But I'm not sure that even that is going to make much of a difference to the result.
All right, Ben Bradshaw, really good to talk to you. Thank you, Ben.
And you.
Now, a couple of your thoughts here. This is from our listener, John. He says, for me, it's perfectly obvious why Sunak decided to gamble on an election now. The reason is he knows we have a summer ahead when large numbers of small boats will cross the channel, and he knows there will never be any good news about the Rwanda plan. If he gets any planes to leave the country, they'll probably have no more than a handful of migrants on board. He knows his toast will be well and truly burned if that comes to pass, as it undoubtedly will. And here is another one of your thoughts. Go Rishi, says our listener. He was great in COVID. Everyone gives him such a hard time, including all of you radio presenters. Everything you're saying is biased. Change that, please. Some fair presenting would be great. That's us told. And here's another. If Labour gets a big majority, the hard left will reappear. Everyone who's a centralist, who just wants a change, will regret it. It's never discussed. Well, you have discussed it. We have mentioned it. We do, by the way, do discuss the future complexion of our political parties when it comes to elections and what happens afterwards. Speaking of which, let me welcome to Pienaar Friends with Kate Ferguson and Kate McCann. Michael Heseltine in just a minute. Lord Heseltine, a master of strategy, a master of communication, a guy who always used to think of himself, and not without good reason, as a winner. Well, can he give winning advice to Rishi Sunak in this situation? Because I think all advice is going to be welcome. Kate, if you were advising Rishi Sunak now in how to turn things around, it's fair to talk about it in those terms because things are facing the wrong way right now. How do you do it? In a nutshell, what's the piece of advice you could plant in his ear?
God, that would probably make me a lot of money if I could think of the answer to that question. I think you need to very clearly define what your campaign is about, and you need to be very clear and consistent in that message, because in the speech today, there was a bit of looking back to legacy. There was a bit of talking about defence and security, as in don't risk it with Labour. And there was a bit of, I know it's not all rosy and I need to prove myself. I think you need to pick a lane and stick with it, and something that all of your MPs can get behind. I do think actually it's really important, I don't know what Kate thinks about this, to have your MPs and your party and your base behind you and pointing in the right direction, which, by the way, they are not right now. I mean, there were lots of MPs today who feel personally hurt about him announcing the election early because they thought they had more time. You know, even the ones who are standing down, they feel like, I wish I had more time. I didn't see this
You're hearing a lot of that.
Yeah, a lot of that. And I did put that to somebody in Sunak's team earlier and said, you know, your MPs are emotional. And they said to me, well, it's been an emotional parliament. It's not surprising.
Advice for the Prime Minister, for free.
Free Svengali advice for Rishi. Right. I think Kate's right in the sense that you gotta pick a lane. So he's talked. My understanding, right, is part of the reason they've decided to call the snap election is if you go back to those 5 promises he originally made when he was becoming leader, he thinks he can put a ticks by them. So the economy is growing, wages are growing, inflation's down. That's your economy tick. NHS waiting lists have been down, I think, a couple of months. That's your waiting list tick. And he'll say, I've passed laws to stop the boats, i.e. the Rwanda deportation plan. I take the point, even before you say it, John, that numbers crossing are still going up. That plan is not enacted yet. But he can say, well, I've done what I can do there, which is pass the law. So I think they've decided to kind of go, right, while they've got those ticks, seize the moment, go, before they might bleed out in a difficult summer, if those boat crossings really rocket, if the courts do try and thwart that Rwanda plan from actually being actioned. I take Kate's point about MPs being grumpy. They are grumpy. The kind of nature of an election campaign is you're gonna have to just roll your sleeves up and go with it now.
What about? I'm going to ask the same question about Keir Starmer actually. But what about Rishi the man? I mean, he's pretty. When he speaks, he's pretty fluent. He's not lost for words. He doesn't stop mid-sentence. He doesn't do Donald Trump and freeze for 30 seconds or Joe Biden and stumble over his delivery. But he doesn't have that knack of connecting with people. You don't sense there's a particular immediate empathy going on, do you? Is there anything much can be done about that?
I don't think you can pretend to be something you're not, especially nowadays. I just don't think it will sound authentic, and then it just sounds cringe. So what Rishi can, what is the strings to Rishi's bow, right? He's got experience in government. He was chancellor during COVID. He rolled out the furlough scheme. Everyone said to him, you've got to get rid of Liz Truss and bring you in to steady the ship. he can say he has done that and he's been PM. Now, you may not love him, you may not even like him, but he can say, look, I was PM for the past 18 months and I have steadied the ship. I've got inflation down. I've steered us to a new course. What he needs to do is hammer those messages. I'm steady, I'm reliable, don't risk it with the other guy. You can trust me to deliver on this stuff. You know, if you had a small business and you weren't sure how to run it, you'd trust me with the purse strings.
But the problem is you're up against a man whose entire, reason for being as a politician is slow and steady, right? No, Keir Starmer's brand is I mean, it's almost boring. It's I'm so predictable that you really don't have to worry. I think the argument that you could clearly see Rishi Sunak making in that speech, it is about defence and security and risk. And it is about safety, as Kate was saying before. It's not just safety of the country, but about your finances and your family and what that might mean. I think the problem is something that Tim and actually James Bethel highlighted earlier, which is that there is an argument to say if people feel the economy is improving, it's actually less of a risk to switch governments. Because if you think, well, look, it can't be that bad. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Because you guys have maybe started to set us back on the right course. Maybe it's time for me to try, Labour for a change.
Yes.
That might actually incentivise some people to take a bit of a risk or a different direction, depending on how you see it. So it could go either way, I think.
That's such an interesting point. Kate McCann and Kate Ferguson here with me. In a moment, we're going to talk to Nikki Morgan. Baroness Morgan, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister, get her take on things. Stay with us on Pienaar Friends. Tell me what you're thinking. Send us a text. Send us a tweet. On Pienaar Friends this evening with me, John Pienaar, Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday, and Kate McCann, our political editor here at Times Radio. And we're joined by Nikki Morgan, Lady Morgan of Coates, a member of the House of Lords, a former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Welcome, Nikki.
Good evening, John.
Hi. What's your mood right now? It's happened. The button's been pressed. We're off. How are you feeling?
Well, of course, I'm not going to be a candidate in this general election. In fact, as a member of the House of Lords, I'm not even going to get a vote in the general election. So
you're not completely detached, though, Nikki, are you, or are you?
No, I'm not completely detached. And I have, of course, spoken to friends who are going to be candidates. And I think there's a mixture, isn't there, of, I think it's like shock. Nobody expected this to be happening today. And I've just been talking to business managers in the House of Lords about what's going to happen in terms of what's called wash up, which is what happens to the bills that we're going through and how all that's going to work. I think there's a mixture of relief, which is, in a way, we've been waiting for this for an awful long time, and good to get on with it. But also, I think everyone is slightly taken aback by the timing of now. And I'm sure that will be the big topic of conversation for the next few days before we get into the campaign.
Well, certainly for the next few seconds then. Why do you think now?
I think today's inflation figures, although they're not perhaps as low as expected, did signal, and I think one of your contributors was just saying about the view that actually the economy is in a better place. Although, as Rishi Sunak said on the doorstep of Downing Street, it's not. There are still people obviously who are absolutely struggling. But he talked very much, as you'd expect a former chancellor to do, that economic stability was going to be a big part of this election. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. He talked about the plan. I think there's also an element of, everybody was asking, when is it going to happen? And I think he probably thought, well, actually, sooner or later, I've got to, the one thing you do as Prime Minister is this very lonely decision of calling election, but you seize the agenda. And I think you do it at the moment when, you're ready and everyone else, the opponents are not ready. And therefore, you go for it.
Nikki, look, you are a One Nation Tory. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is more to the right of the party. You were, as it were, a Remainer, and the Prime Minister was a Brexiteer. I know at election time, this is maybe a sort of naive and silly question to ask a Conservative, but do you think the Prime Minister is an asset or a liability? And if so, tell me why.
I think the Prime Minister is an asset. And I think why? Because I used to sit next to him in Cabinet, and he is a thoroughly decent, fair-minded individual who actually, when he says, he's going to do something, and that's what he said today, it's very much about, I said I was going to do this and I've done it. And the furlough scheme, which he talked about, which we shouldn't forget, billions of pounds spent supporting businesses and individuals in terms of getting through the pandemic, very much a Rishi Sunak design scheme. And I think that actually that will come out more and more during the campaign. And I think there comes a point where actually I suspect that both he and others, it's sort of, I can sit in Westminster for so long talking about what I want to do in the campaign, or I can just call the election and get out there and start campaigning and connecting. And I think that's what he's decided to do.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that's entirely convincing. Let's get on with it because I can't wait to get started. That's not why people call elections. You call elections because you think either I've got a better chance going now than any other time, or you think maybe it would just be worse if I go later. Maybe both of those things. He is going now because he's worried about what might happen if he doesn't. That's the reality, surely.
I mean, look, we'll probably not know until Tim Shipman's written his next book on this period of history. And at that point, we'll perhaps unravel it. But I do think there's a combination probably of factors. But I think that this point about everyone's talking about it, I've done a lot of what I wanted to do. I can say that actually my 5 pledges are either met or on the way to being met. Got the Rwanda bill through. And actually there comes a point where I think that when an election's in the offing, that the whole of government starts to slow down. It becomes impossible to plan any more than a matter of weeks ahead.
Yes.
I think that probably the chances of having another big fiscal event in the autumn with potential tax cuts became less and less possible.
Right.
So in a way, you might as well just go for it.
You accept that then, Nikki? You accept that public borrowing going in the wrong direction, as it were, meant the Chancellor just didn't have the room for an election-winning pre-election budget. That's your take too.
Well, I think, I mean, I've been quite clear and consistent for a while now that actually I think that what people wanted is this economic stability which Rishi Sunak has brought. And people weren't looking. They know that there is obviously a lot of competing priorities. The 2.5% increase in defence spending, for example, as we live in an increasingly uncertain world. And so actually, I think probably it was hard enough to deliver the budget in March in terms of the debate between whether you cut income tax or national insurance. To go around those houses again, I think would have been, with another OBR forecast, would have been difficult. And I think one of the things that lots of people outside government who need government to be functioning, to be spending money, need is what's called a spending review, where you plan government expenditure the next couple of years. That can't happen now until we've had an election.
Yeah, and Nikki, you're in danger of sounding optimistic about the Tory party's chances.
I'm always optimistic at the start of an election because I know there are plenty of campaigns where the unexpected can happen, and until you get on those out on those doorsteps in the country talking to people, and I think that we'll just have to see. Look, you've covered plenty of campaigns, John, where things have gone awry for even the parties that are meant to be in the lead.
Yes, I have. But when you talk about unexpected, you include in your definition of unexpected astonishing, I take it.
But as I say, I was there in the 2017 general election. If you remember at that time when we were all told, no, Theresa May was going to have this big majority and that was going to give her massive amounts of freedom to do what she wanted in Parliament, and it didn't turn out like that. 2015, we were told that Edmund Aband and Labour were going to do incredibly well. That didn't happen. 2019, when actually a much bigger majority. There's no complacency at all. You have to fight for every single vote, but there will be surprising results. We'll have to see on the 4th of July when we get to 10:01 what the exit poll tells us.
Well, no one's voted. That much is absolutely true. Kate Ferguson.
Hi, Nikki. Are you confident enough to put a flutter on, do you think? And also, the actual real question is, people haven't kind of warmed to Rishi Sunak. The public hasn't warmed to him as a political leader. Do you think there's time for him to turn that around? How can he try and make people warm to him, do you think?
So no, I never put money on, thanks. I never answer maths questions. I never put money on anything. There's lots of things that I've learned not to do.
But Kate Ferguson will bet you lunch. She's in the habit of doing that.
Well, we'll talk about where that lunch might be. It might be tempting. Do I think that people will warm to Rishi Sunak? Yes, because I think that actually what you see in campaigns are often the real politicians unvarnished, both when things go well and things don't go so well. But I think part of this and part of what he was trying to set out today is less about people warming to him and more about, we live in a very uncertain world. These are things I've done. I think I've done what I said I was going to do, and I'd like to do more. And this is why I'd like to be in power for another 5 years. And people will have, I mean, he mentioned the word I thought was very interesting. The speech was very much directed at us, well, I'm not the electorate, as I just said, but other people who are going to be the electorate. It was about you, your choice. This is up to you. And I think that's what that's what elections do, is they stop people just responding to polls and make people make a decision about who they're going to vote for.
Nikki Morgan, Baroness Morgan, lovely to talk to you as always, Nikki. Let's talk again soon. It is always a pleasure. Now, here's some of your thoughts listening to this. This is Paul's thought. Do you think he's gone for an election before there were any more defections? Well, there's a thought. Ian says, just wondering, guys, what's the collective noun for Kates? And this is in from John.
Terrifying.
Terrifying. Has anyone mentioned the fact the European Football Championships is on during the election campaign? The feel-good factor. We haven't touched on that, actually. That is an interesting point. Harold Wilson tried that. I mean, that was at least discussed during Harold Wilson's time back in the day. I'm not sure it did work out quite that way, but it always comes up at election time. Is there a football tournament? And sure enough, there is, coming up in the next few weeks.
I haven't got anything to say to you on football. Kate might have more on that, but I do have a little bit of news for you, and it's something that we should watch out for over the next couple of days, because it's a personal statement. Holly Lynch, who's a Labour MP for Halifax, is announced she's going to be standing down, and I think we're probably going to be seeing more of these MPs over the coming days, which means reselections. It means choosing new candidates. Not a huge amount of time to do that, has to be said. She says that the pressures of basically a young family, and working in Parliament, it means that she's changed her priorities, and she's been thinking about it, and she's not going to continue as an MP. But it's interesting, and there will be others who will want to do the same.
There will. We need to watch that, don't we?
Yeah.
Don't we, guys? I mean, there's been some sort of chatter and speculation about the complexion of the next set of parties in Parliament. One of our listeners was texting earlier on, suggesting that the Labour Party would be shifting further to the left, as if the party grows, there'll be more left wingers. However, I think the evidence that we've seen so far is that the centre of the Labour Party headquarters has had a pretty tight hold on the selection of candidates. And they've managed to ensure that as and when the party grows, and expectation is that it will grow, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite. We weren't really expecting Holly Lynch to necessarily do this. We're really braced for more Tories to resign, aren't we, Kate, than Labour? Because Labour are obviously the ones kind of with power within their grasp. Labour HQ have had an iron grip on this selection process for their MPs. People should be under no illusion. Yes, there may be a couple of left wingers, but this is Starmer's selection process, and we expect that to be quite a moderate, very Starmer loyalist intake that we're getting at the next election. So you would not expect kind of the socialist campaign group, which are the kind of left-wing Labour MPs, to particularly beef up their ranks here. In fact, they may end up being diminished as some leave at the election and then not replenished.
And what about the makeup of the next Parliamentary Conservative Party? Because, look, as I say, need to say we don't know what's going to happen. People haven't voted yet, but a lot of those marginal seats are in the so-called red wall areas, in the Midlands, in the north, where you have a lot of right-leaning former Boris Johnson supporters. If they are going to succumb to a swing, it doesn't take a huge swing, then you're going to see a change in the complexion of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, Kate.